In the forgotten corners of the world, where the jungle reclaims temples and time swallows memory, there are stories not meant to be told aloud, only whispered. This is Whispers of Asia, a place where haunting rituals, ancestral curses, and sacred shadows still walk among the living, where death is not the end, and the silence of the past is louder than it seems. Tonight, we travel deep into the mountains of Northern Thailand, to a temple sealed for generations, a place abandoned by monks, cursed by grief, and wrapped in crimson thread. Some robes were never meant to be worn, some spirits never meant to be remembered. This is the story of the threads beneath Wat Chao Sorn and the woman who dared to weave the dead. They told her not to go 3 separate times. Once from a cab driver who made the sign of the Buddha at a red light. Once from the market woman who sold her steamed rice and mango with too much sweetness in her smile. And once, most chillingly, from a child with thread wrapped around his wrist who looked up at her and said, "Don't go where the cloth sings." Sai wasn't easily shaken. Half Thai, half British, she had grown up walking between worlds, hearing ghost stories from her grandmother while also studying anthropology at King's College. But fieldwork was her true obsession. And this trip, this story, was supposed to be her thesis-defining discovery. She arrived in Shangdao with 2 suitcases and a recorder already half full of whispers. The village nestled between mists and mountains, where the jungle rose thick like breath, and time moved differently, slower, like it too was unsure whether to stay. Sai had come in search of vanishing Lana funerary rituals, the ceremonial practices once used to guide the soul from the body into the next life. But what she found instead was a name the locals only muttered under their breath: Wat Chao Sorn. The name wasn't written on maps. It wasn't even mentioned in the district archives. And yet it lingered, on old lips, in dreams, in the way people crossed the street near a certain path without looking. A place swallowed by the jungle, hidden behind vines and time, its memory fraying like old cloth. Sai was sitting with a 90-year-old weaver named Madame, who spoke of the old ways while her fingers moved with uncanny precision, twisting thread into shapes like language. The old woman's hut smelled of lemongrass and camphor, but behind the herbal scent was something else, mold, perhaps, or dried blood. "I used to weave robes for monks," Madame said softly, her eyes clouded with memory. "Before the red thread, before she came." "Who?" But the weaver shook her head, lips pursed, fingers suddenly still. Then she whispered something that made Sai's skin tighten across her spine. "Some threads remember too much, and some should never be pulled." That night, Sai reviewed her recordings under the glow of her laptop. The power flickered once, twice. Outside, cicadas screamed, but beneath their call, she thought she heard something. Softer. A humming. She paused the audio. The sound continued. No, not humming. Weaving. Like thread pulled taut across an old wooden loom. She turned off the laptop. Silence returned like a sudden breath held too long. Maybe it was just the wind. Maybe it was just her nerves. She'd been in stranger villages, after all. Seen bodies burned in open-air towers, collected chants for ghosts with no names. But there was something wrong in the air, something that had waited too long to be touched. And she knew, deep in her gut, that whatever Wat Chao Sorn was, it hadn't been forgotten, it had been sealed. The next morning, Sai ventured into the village again. She asked the local monks about the temple. Most denied its existence. A few just looked away. But one, Pra Niran, an aging monk with pale eyes and burns along his wrist, finally spoke. "Wat Chao Sorn was closed before I was born," he said, pouring her tea with a trembling hand. "It was built for the dead, but it became a place the dead refused to leave." He told her of a time when robes were more than cloth, when they were vessels stitched with hair, blood, teeth, and memory, when monks practiced a ritual known as Pa Phra Nun Jai, the robe that remembers. Sai's hand tightened on her recorder. "That ritual," she asked, voice barely above a whisper, "it binds souls?" "It traps them," he corrected. "They thought they were helping, but all they did was hold the dead too long." Sai spent the evening staring at the map she had drawn by hand from verbal directions, a path through the forest, a curve near the broken spirit house, a banyan tree with red thread wrapped around its roots. At midnight, she opened her notebook and wrote one word: go. She didn't tell the homestay owner where she was heading. The woman was already too superstitious, too prone to muttering prayers under her breath when Sai came back late. Sai packed lightly: water, camera, notebook, incense for offerings, and a small Buddha amulet her grandmother had given her as a child. She wasn't religious, but the weight of it felt right, like a promise. The path was overgrown and smelled of wet roots and something older. The air grew still as she walked, as if even the wind was holding its breath. The further she went, the quieter it became. No birds, no insects, only the sound of her own footsteps. Then she saw it. Wat Chao Sorn. It emerged like a ghost, half swallowed by vines and moss, its wooden stilts warped with age, but still standing. Crimson threads hung from the rafters like cobwebs. The doors were bound with cloth, not locked, not nailed, tied. She felt her pulse in her throat. A whisper rose in her mind. Some threads should stay buried. She stepped forward. Inside, it was dark, but not empty. The air smelled of old smoke, wax, and something metallic. Dust floated in slanted rays of light that pushed through the shutters. At the center of the room was an altar, but instead of a Buddha, it held a loom, an old ceremonial loom, covered in red thread, blackened by ash. Around it lay broken robes, tattered cloth stitched with script too faded to read. She moved slowly, taking photographs, breathing through her mouth to keep the scent at bay. She didn't notice the threads at her feet until her camera flash flickered. They were wrapped around her ankles. Just once, just a loose ring, but when she tried to lift her foot, it wouldn't move. The air behind her shifted, the threads on the loom twitched, and in that silence, she heard it again, weaving. A sound like a memory being sewn back together. Sai didn't scream. She whispered, "Hello?" The air didn't answer, but the loom did. It creaked, and in the dust behind it, a shadow moved. The path to Wat Chao Sorn began with silence. Not the kind of silence that comes at night, nor the kind that sits between the chirps of birds and hums of insects, but a silence that seemed placed, as though someone had laid it over the forest like a shroud. Sai knew that kind of quiet. She'd only heard it once before, at her grandmother's funeral, when the monks had stopped chanting and the wind refused to blow. Now it greeted her like an old memory. She stood before the overgrown trail, where the dirt path thinned into a narrow strip between tangled roots and swaying bamboo. Her guide, a teenage boy paid in cash and herbal cigarettes, had stopped walking half a kilometer back. "This is as far as I go," he'd said. "You go further, you go alone." Sai hadn't argued. That was part of the deal. Everyone knew where the temple was, but no one would take you all the way. It wasn't out of laziness or fear of ghosts exactly. It was something more primal. They believed the place remembered you. With each step, the air changed. The trees grew thicker, leaning in as though listening. The light, once golden, dimmed to amber, then rust, then gray. Sai moved carefully, brushing aside spiderwebs, noting the signs. A headless spirit house cracked at the base of a banyan tree, a crow feather tied in red thread to a branch, a warding maybe. Finally, after nearly an hour of walking, she saw it. Wat Chao Sorn. It rose from the jungle like a corpse half swallowed by the earth. The stilts of the wooden temple were grayed with age, warped like bones left too long in the sun. Moss clung to the walls. Ivy crept across the broken eaves. Yet despite the ruin, it stood tall, as though waiting. Sai stopped at the edge of the clearing. There were cloths tied to the trees surrounding the temple, long red ribbons, faded and frayed. They fluttered despite the still air. At the base of the entrance stairs, bundles of offerings lay rotting, dried flowers, incense stubs, the remains of wax figurines melted down to shadows. This place wasn't forgotten. It was avoided. Sai stepped forward. The steps groaned beneath her feet. Up close, the temple looked almost intact. The wood had aged, yes, and much of the paint had peeled into strips, but the structure itself stood firm. Its doors were shut, tied together with braided crimson cloth. She reached out, fingers brushing the rough thread. It was stiff and sticky. She frowned. Blood? She pulled back her hand. No visible stain, no residue. And yet a coppery scent lingered in the air, just faint enough to feel imagined. She reached again. This time, she untied the cloth. It fell with a whisper. Inside, the light dimmed even further. The interior was narrow and long, lit only by slats in the wooden wall and holes in the roof where time had peeled it open. The beams above were hung with ropes, cloths, and disturbingly, what looked like weavings, but not just decorative ones. Robes. Robes like the ones Sai had seen on forest monks. Only these weren't dyed saffron or orange. They were red, deep, aged crimson, some nearly black, and each had something embedded in the fabric. Coins, nails, bones. She stepped closer. One robe was child-sized. Another was missing its sleeves entirely, stitched closed where the arms should have been. The altar at the end of the room was not a traditional Buddhist one. No golden Buddha, no statue of any kind. Instead, it held a loom. Old, carved, still strung with half-woven cloth. Dust caked the surface, but the red thread shimmered as though freshly spun. She knelt beside it, tracing a hand over the wooden frame. Something scraped beneath her fingers. A knife. A weaving knife, carved with old Lana script. She recognized one of the characters, Chai. It meant heart or mind. But when placed in certain contexts, it could also mean soul. She stood, taking slow, careful photos of everything. The camera clicked softly, muffled by the air. Her footsteps stirred the dust into sluggish clouds. Each robe she passed seemed to turn toward her slightly, as though aware of her presence. She turned to leave, and froze. A faint sound from behind the altar. Creak. Wood shifting. Thread being pulled. Sai's throat tightened. She stepped slowly around the altar and looked beneath the platform where the loom sat. And there, half buried in the shadow, was a bundle, wrapped in red cloth, tied with strands of hair, and trembling slightly. She dropped to her knees. Her hand hovered over the bundle. Every instinct screamed to leave it be, to turn and walk out, forget the story, the thesis, the curiosity. But her other instinct, her darker, deeper one, whispered, "You came this far." She untied the cloth. Inside were robes. 5, carefully folded, old but preserved. Each had a name stitched into the hem. The thread used wasn't cotton. It was black, coarse, human hair. She reached for the top robe and stopped. There was moisture. The bottom robe was damp. She recoiled. The scent hit her a moment later, thick, metallic, ancient. Blood, still wet. Sai staggered back, her heart pounding. The loom groaned again, and for a brief moment she saw it. A shadow, sitting at the loom, weaving, one thread at a time. She blinked, and it was gone. The robes lay still. The room was silent, but the altar seemed to breathe. Outside, the wind had changed. The red cloths tied to the trees now pointed toward the temple instead of away. The jungle sounds had returned, but wrong, each chirp too sharp, each rustle too close. Sai looked back one last time before stepping down the stairs. In the window, above the altar, a figure stood, draped in red, watching her. She didn't run. She walked, slowly, purposefully, her feet unsure but moving, the robe bundle now tucked into her bag, the weaving knife wrapped in a scarf and hidden beneath her camera. She didn't stop until she reached the road again. When she turned back, the path was gone. The forest had swallowed it. Wat Chao Sorn was no longer behind her, but somehow it was closer than ever. It was past midnight when Sai finally unwrapped the bundle. She sat cross-legged on the floor of her homestay, the dim yellow light from a single desk lamp casting long shadows on the walls. Outside, the forest breathed through the open slats of the window. Crickets chirped, leaves shifted like whispers, but inside her room, time seemed suspended, held in place by something ancient. The robes lay before her, each folded with ceremonial precision, as if whoever last touched them feared to offend the dead. There were 5 in total. The top robe was dry, stiff with age, and embroidered with faded golden thread along the hem. The symbols weren't Thai script, at least not modern Thai. They were older. Lana, perhaps, but mixed with something else. Sai had seen similar patterns in funerary scrolls from centuries ago. Symbols meant to seal, not decorate. The second robe was different, stitched with what looked like teeth pressed flat into the lining, tiny ones, children's teeth. Sai felt her stomach turn. The third was missing a corner, the fabric frayed and stained as though it had been torn off violently. In the missing space, the threads had unraveled into a distinct shape, a handprint, small, thin-fingered. The fourth was the most elaborate. It shimmered even under low light, not with gold, but with something wet. Its hem was coated with layers of overlapping red thread, fused by time and something darker. And then the fifth, the one that had been damp. She touched it last, still soft, still warm, still bleeding. Sai spent the rest of the night scouring her notes, digital archives, and any text she had on obscure Northern Thai rituals. She needed context, clues, a name. That's when she found it. Pa Pra Nun Jai. The term was buried deep in an untranslated manuscript from the 18th century, written by a Lama monk during the Burmese-Siamese conflicts. Roughly, it meant robe of the remembering mind, but its true meaning was more disturbing. The ritual described was not about honoring the dead, but binding their memory to the living. The weaver would stitch the robe using hair from the deceased, ash from their funeral pyre, and blood from their closest kin. In doing so, it was believed the soul would remain accessible, not in heaven, not reincarnated, but near, always near. It was practiced in grief, in desperation, and, as the monk warned, in dangerous love. Sai leaned back in her chair, mind racing. This wasn't a superstition. This was spiritual technology, a system of belief developed over generations to preserve what should have passed on. The robes she had found weren't simply ceremonial artifacts. They were vessels. She returned to the bundle and examined the stitch patterns again. One of the robes, she couldn't tell which, began to give off a faint scent. Not rot, not incense. Jasmine, the flower of mourning. Sai's hand trembled slightly. She reached for her recorder and began speaking aloud, cataloging the details. Subject: robes recovered from Wat Chao Sorn, 5 pieces. Ritual appears consistent with Pa Pra Nun Jai. Stitching includes human teeth, hair, possibly bone. Blood-stained fabric still wet after exposure to open air. Note: the robes are not degrading naturally. Some sections appear preserved by unknown means. She paused the recording. Silence. Then, rustling. Behind her. She turned sharply. No one. Just her coat hanging on the chair, the old woven one from her grandmother. It fluttered gently, though there was no breeze. Sai stood slowly. Her eyes moved to the window. Something passed just beyond it, a shadow. And then, another. The next morning, Sai walked to the monastery. She had questions, and she needed someone who remembered the old world. She found Pra Naran sweeping leaves along the stone path. His back was bent, his expression distant, but when she showed him a photo of the robes, he dropped his broom. The color drained from his face. "You found them," he whispered. "You brought them back." "I didn't," Sai began, but he raised a hand. "No, don't lie. They came with you. I can smell the thread." He took her inside the prayer hall and sat her before a small clay Buddha, cracked at the base. There he told her the story. A long time ago, in the hills above Chongal, there lived a weaver monk named Pra Kam Chai. He was renowned for his discipline, his wisdom, and his grief. His mother had died suddenly. She had raised him alone, abandoned by her husband, and Kam Chai had promised her that he would never forget her. But the rituals of the Sangha demanded detachment. Forgetting was part of letting go. Kamchai refused. He began studying the forbidden scrolls kept in the hidden libraries beneath the Vihan. He rediscovered the Pa Pra Nunjai, but he didn't stop at the ritual. He modified it. Instead of ashes, he used fresh blood. Instead of hair, he used strands taken while his mother was still alive. He stitched her memories into the fabric, her laughter, her sorrow, her final breath. And when the robe was complete, he wrapped her corpse in it and whispered the chant of binding, not once, but for 9 nights. The morning after the final chant, villagers said they saw Kamchai weeping under the Bodhi tree, calling her name. But he wasn't alone. They say his mother stood beside him. Only her skin was pale, her eyes were empty, and her mouth moved without sound, weaving endlessly with invisible thread. "What happened to him?" Sai asked. Praniran stared at the altar. "No one knows, but the robes were sealed, the temple closed, and the weaver forgotten." Sai left the monastery with shaking hands. The story wasn't just a warning, it was a mirror. She remembered the shadow in the temple, the feeling of being watched, the red threads wrapped around her ankles like a question left unanswered. The robes hadn't stayed sealed, and whatever was bound inside them wanted to be remembered. That night, her dreams twisted. She stood on a hill, surrounded by robes hung on wooden poles like scarecrows. Each one turned slowly in the windless air. Beneath them, the ground was red. A woman's voice whispered behind her ear, "The cloth remembers what the heart forgets." When she woke, the bundle of robes was open. One had been unfolded, and in the center of the room, placed neatly on the floor, was her grandmother's old coat, but stitched across the collar in red thread she didn't put there was a word written in Lana script: Chai, soul. The morning air was still, not calm, not peaceful, still, like a held breath, like the world had paused while something old and buried stirred. Sai sat by the window, sunlight filtering through the slats in trembling beams, watching the robe she had unfolded the night before. It lay across the floor exactly where it had not been when she went to sleep. She hadn't moved it. Of that she was certain. But it had been moved, folded with care, placed deliberately. And the coat, the one that had belonged to her grandmother, was now folded beneath the robe, like an offering. The red thread stitched across the collar was gone, vanished. But Sai remembered it clearly, the Lana symbol for Chai, soul. It hadn't been a dream. It couldn't have been. She rose slowly, the wooden floor creaking beneath her feet, and approached the robe. Her fingers hovered just above the cloth. The air above it felt warmer, as if it breathed faint heat. Her fingertips twitched. She touched it. The robe was soft, softer than it should have been. Not the brittle, ancient stiffness of old cloth, but supple, pliant, as if it had only just been woven. And beneath her fingers she could feel it. A pulse. Sai knew the ritual by now. She had read the translations. Paparanunjai was not just about weaving cloth, it was about weaving memory. And that meant these robes weren't just ceremonial objects. They were records, maybe even voices. She fetched her scissors, a magnifying glass, a needle, gloves. Then she began to dissect the robe. Not cruelly, surgically, with reverence. The outer layer was simple enough, red-dyed cotton, slightly uneven in weave. But tucked between the layers, sewn into the very lining, were fragments of something more sinister. She found a lock of hair wrapped around a tooth, tiny shards of bone, smoothed and polished, a small scrap of parchment, illegible but inked in black with a single circle inside a square, and finally, beneath the inner fold, a thin glass bead, the kind placed in the mouths of the dead during certain Lana funerals to carry their last words. But this bead was cracked and blackened. She dropped it instinctively. It rolled once across the floor and stopped at the feet of her chair. Then it shattered, without pressure, without force, just shattered. A faint hiss escaped from the empty space where it broke. Sai froze. She didn't breathe. Something had been released. That night, Sai didn't dream. She remembered. She remembered walking barefoot on wet soil, the feel of needles piercing her fingertips, the scent of burning hair, the weight of grief so heavy it sunk into her bones. Only they weren't her memories. She awoke gasping and found thread wrapped around her fingers. Red thread, looped, knotted, fresh, still damp. She called Praniran the next morning. Her voice was hoarse. Her hands shook. "I need to show you something." He didn't ask what. He told her to come before sunset. She arrived at the monastery just as the sky turned saffron and bruised. Praniran led her not to the main hall, but to a small stone building behind the temple. It looked like a storage shed, but inside it was lined with glass cabinets. And in those cabinets, robes, wrapped, preserved, each tagged in Lana script. "These are what remain," he said, voice low. "The survivors, some from families who still remember, some from temples that dared to speak of the ritual." Sai turned slowly, eyes wide. There were dozens. "This one," he said, pointing to a folded bundle stitched with black thread. "That's from a novice who died of fever. They bound his voice in the cloth so he could finish his prayers in the afterlife." She touched the glass. "He never stopped. The chanting still echoes on the full moon." Sai looked at him. "Why were these kept?" He smiled, tired, old. "Because not all rituals are curses. Some are just unfinished." On the walk back, Sai asked the question that had begun to haunt her. "Can a robe bind someone who isn't dead?" Praniran stopped. The breeze stirred the chimes above the pagoda. He looked at her, then at her hands. The red thread around her fingers hadn't gone unnoticed. "You've already begun, haven't you?" She didn't answer. He didn't need her to. "You must understand," he said quietly. "The Pa Pranunjai doesn't care whether a soul is ready. It only asks if someone wants it enough, if they remember hard enough, if they grieve deeply enough." He paused. "And grief doesn't wait for death." That evening, Sai returned to her room. All 5 robes were unfolded now. She hadn't touched them. They had arranged themselves in a perfect circle around her chair. At the center sat her grandmother's coat. No thread, No stitching, just memory, waiting. She dropped to her knees and whispered into the fabric, hands trembling. I don't want you to come back, but I still remember. The coat was warm beneath her touch. That night, the loom returned, not physically, but in her dreams. It stood in the temple again, only this time it was glowing, its threads shimmering like blood under moonlight. A woman sat before it, weaving with fingers that moved too quickly to be human. She turned her head, slowly, cracking at the neck. Her face was blank. No eyes, no mouth, just thread stitched across her skin. And in a voice that didn't belong to any living thing, she whispered, "Finish what he started." That night, Sai lit a single candle. She placed it in the center of her room, surrounded by the 5 robes, now arranged like petals of a dark flower. She wasn't sure why she did it. It didn't feel like an academic exercise anymore. It felt like reverence or warning. The air was still, too still. The candle's flame didn't flicker, not once. Sai sat cross-legged in front of the robes, holding her recorder, her hands pale and cold. "Field notes," she said into the mic. "The robes respond to presence, possibly to intention. Patterns of movement and arrangement suggest agency. I've begun to experience dreams, no visitations, rituals that don't feel like imagination." She hesitated, the silence pressing close. "There's something inside these robes, and I think it wants me to remember something that isn't mine." She clicked off the recorder and blew out the candle. Darkness swallowed the room. When Sai fell asleep, she didn't dream. She woke up somewhere else. She was standing barefoot on a dirt path, the sky above her muted with gray mist. A procession moved slowly ahead of her, figures draped in deep red robes, their faces hidden beneath heavy hoods. None of them spoke. None of them looked at her. Each carried something in their hands, a photo, a string of hair, a folded cloth. And every single one had their mouths sewn shut. Thread. Red thread. She tried to speak, to ask where she was, but no sound came from her mouth either. She touched her lips. Thread. Pulled tight across her skin. She choked, panicked, tried to rip it out, but her hands were not her own. They moved to her chest and unfolded a robe. One of the 5. The damped one. She held it like an offering. Ahead of her, the procession stopped before an old temple, its wood warped, its roof sagging. Wat Chao Sorn. The doors creaked open without touch. Inside, a fire burned on the loom. Not beneath it, on it. Flames wrapped around the weaving, and from them emerged a shape. A woman, charred, glowing, wrapped in red. She stepped from the loom and turned her face toward Sai. Her eyes were gone. Her smile was sewn shut, but her hand reached forward, and in her palm was a needle, old, blackened, still warm. She didn't go outside for the rest of the day, didn't speak to the homestay owner, didn't eat, didn't write. She sat and listened. The sound returned just after sunset. The weaving, a soft pull of thread across wood. She tried to ignore it, told herself it was in her head, until she looked down and saw the thread, red, thin, glistening, moving across the floor toward her toes. She stood up fast, heart thudding, the stool clattering behind her. The thread stopped, but it didn't disappear. It was waiting. Sai recorded again. Her voice was flat, hollow. "I don't think this is just about the robes. I think they're not finished. The ritual wasn't completed. Maybe it can't be completed, or maybe it's waiting for someone to continue it." She hesitated. "I think that someone might be me." That night, she put the robes back in the bundle, tied them tight, locked them in a trunk under her bed. But she still woke up at exactly 3:33 a.m. Her hands were moving on their own, sewing. The air smelled of jasmine and blood, and on her lap lay a sixth robe, half woven, with her own name stitched into the hem. In the morning, she burned incense, not because she believed it would help, but because it made the room smell of something other than fear. She called Pra Niran again, but this time he didn't answer. Instead, she heard a voice in the background of the call. Not the monk, a woman, whispering in a dialect Sai didn't recognize, but one word repeated: Q, Q, Q. She looked it up later. In Old Lana, it meant remember. Sai decided she would go back to Wat Chao Sorn, not to run, not even to investigate, but because she had to know who was the weaver and who was being remembered. Because it wasn't just about Kamchai anymore. It was about her. The dreams, the shadows, the robes, they weren't echoes of someone else's grief. They were calling to hers. The chapter closed with Sai wrapping her grandmother's coat in cloth and placing it in the center of the circle. She lit a candle and whispered, "I'm listening now." Outside, the wind carried the soft, rhythmic pull of thread through wood, and for the first time, Sai didn't feel afraid. She felt seen. Sai returned to Wat Chao Sorn with the caution of someone approaching a sleeping god. This time, she didn't bring a camera, no notebook, no voice recorder. She brought only incense, salt, and the amulet her grandmother gave her, a tiny jade Buddha on a frayed red cord. The air around the temple was heavier now. It knew her, and somehow it was letting her in. The wooden stairs groaned beneath her weight like breath escaping the bones of the building. The red threads still hung from the beams like veins, twitching with unseen movement. The altar stood exactly as before. So did the loom. But this time, Sai noticed something she hadn't before. A statue behind the altar, half buried in shadows, a half-buried Buddha cracked through the chest, its hands broken off. At first, it looked like nothing more than decay, but as she circled it, her eyes narrowed. There was a seam, not part of the original sculpture, not stone, wood. Hidden behind the front panel of the statue, covered in years of dust, was a compartment. Inside was a bundle of dried banana leaves, tied with thread, sealed with wax, and bound with an old monk's sash. She broke the seal and unfolded a journal. It was written in ancient Lana script, the ink faded, but preserved well enough for her to read. The pages crackled as she turned them, her breath shallow. The first page bore a name: Prakamchai, Temple Weaver, year 2274 of the Buddhist era, 1731 CE. What followed was not a monk's record of ritual or temple accounts. It was a confession. My mother Chala passed from this world in my arms, but her voice lingered in the rafters, her hands in the patterns of my dreams. My duty was to let her go. My love refused. The old scroll spoke of Pa Pranun Jai, but they lacked depth. They instructed on the ritual, but not the intention. I added my own. 9 nights I wove her robe. I took her hair, her blood still warm. I mixed it with mine. She whispered to me on the 7th night. I thought it was memory. By the 9th, she was sitting beside me, her skin gray, her eyes hollow. I did not stop weaving. Her presence filled the temple. The novices left. The abbot fled. I began to forget what she looked like before I called her back, but she remembered everything, and she began to teach me. Sai's hands trembled as she turned the pages. The journal grew darker, the words slanted and frantic. There were diagrams, stitches and symbols, instructions for creating robes that could hold not just memory, but intent. Robes that could speak, robes that could control. Kamchai had crossed a boundary. He wasn't just a grieving son. He became a ritualist, a channel, a doorway. One entry chilled her. My mother asked me to bind the others. I refused. Then she stopped whispering and began screaming. Sai dropped the journal. The sound echoed through the hollow space of the temple. From somewhere deep inside the walls, she heard a soft, dragging sound. Not footsteps, not animals, cloth, sliding across old wood. Sai stuffed the journal into her bag and ran. That night, Sai didn't dream. She remembered. She was Kamchai. She was weaving, blood on her hands, thread between her teeth, the loom beneath her burning red as the spirit behind her whispered, "Not finished. More. Always more." She woke up screaming. Her fingers were raw, and her bed was covered in cut thread as if she'd ripped something apart in her sleep. The next day, she went to Pra Niran. This time, she brought the journal. He didn't speak for a long time after reading it. When he did, his voice was low. Kamchai wasn't alone. Others tried the ritual after him, but none reached his depth. Sai's eyes were dark. He didn't bind memory. He bound will. Pra Niran nodded slowly. Yes, and now that thread is unraveling. The monk offered Sai a final piece of knowledge, a chant, short, ancient, older than the robe ritual. Not a prayer, but a cutting, a way to unbind the soul from the fabric it clung to. But it came with a warning. You can only use it once, and you must choose carefully what to free, because the others will grow stronger when you do. That night, Sai stood before the robes in her room. They were breathing now. She could hear it, soft like wind inside cloth. They pulsed gently, as if listening. She took a deep breath and spoke the chant. Her voice shook. The candle beside her guttered and died. And from within the folds of the damp robe, a scream erupted. Not human, not animal. Thread itself, recoiling. Then silence. The dampness vanished. The robe turned black at the hem, and the whispering stopped for a moment. In the silence that followed, Sai knelt before the loom in her mind and saw Kamchai's face, a man hollowed by memory, a man swallowed by grief, a man who had become thread himself. He looked at her and smiled. You have remembered enough to finish what I began. Now weave. The words came to her in fragments. They weren't written clearly in Kanchai's journal, but hidden in margins, etched into robes, scratched faintly into the back of a weaving knife. Repetition, symbols, sounds meant not for the tongue, but for the soul. Sai began to piece them together one syllable at a time. Na, rat, pra, sorn, chai. The first time she whispered them aloud, the air shifted, not dramatically, just slightly, enough to make the curtain sway, enough to silence the cicadas. The second time, the candle flame turned blue. And on the third night, the thread on her windowsill knotted itself. She didn't know why she kept going. Curiosity, perhaps, or obsession, or maybe something deeper, something the robes had seeded in her, stitching themselves not just into her dreams, but her will. She found herself humming the chant without realizing it, while brushing her hair, boiling rice, standing in line at the market. The syllables wrapped themselves around her like a comfort she couldn't understand. But the comfort came with a cost. It began with the dog. Her neighbor Noi owned a mangy brown mutt named Ploy that barked at everything: snakes, tourists, wind. But on the fourth day of the chant, Ploy stopped barking. Sai found him curled beneath her porch, eyes wide open, mouth sewn shut with red thread. Alive, but silent. Noi came pounding at her door the next morning, hysterical. "You did something!" she screamed, eyes wild, face streaked with tears. She didn't deny it. She couldn't, not with the red thread still clinging to her windowsill. That evening, Sai returned to the journal. There was a diagram she hadn't noticed before, hidden in a fold near the spine. It depicted the structure of the chant, like a weaving pattern, rows of syllables intersecting, layered, spiraling inward toward a single word at the center: Chon. She searched for a translation. It meant to pull something from beyond. Not summon, not invoke, but drag back. Sai tried to stop saying it. She taped her mouth shut at night. She scattered salt across the robes. She placed mirrors facing inward. None of it helped. By the sixth night, she woke with her fingers moving in the air, mimicking the motion of the loom. Her fingernails were cracked, her mouth dry, and in the shadows of her room, the robes hung without hooks, suspended in mid-air, shifting, watching, waiting. She went to the temple again. Not Wat Chao Sorn, she couldn't go back there yet. Instead, she went to Praniran's monastery. But he wasn't there. In his place sat a young novice, no more than 10 years old, staring blankly at the wall. When she asked for the monk, the boy just shook his head, and then lifted his hand and drew a line across his lips. Sai's stomach turned cold. "No," she whispered. But the boy only smiled, and thread began to bleed from the corners of his mouth. She ran. Back through the village, past the shrine, past the banyan tree wrapped in red. The thread was everywhere now, in the water buckets, on the fence posts, beneath the rice bowls. It was spreading, and Sai knew deep down it was because she had spoken the chant wrong. Or worse, she had spoken it correctly. That night, Sai tried to burn one of the robes. She laid it in a metal basin, doused it in oil, and struck a match. The cloth caught fire immediately, but then the fire changed, burning cold, white, and silent. And from within the robe came a voice, not loud, not screaming, but whispering. Why do you forget me? Sai dropped the match and stumbled back. The flame extinguished itself, and the robe, unburned, lay pristine, except for one change. Her own name was now stitched into the hem. She barricaded herself in her room, nailed the windows shut, placed the robes back in the trunk, but the chant didn't stop. Now it was coming from outside her room, from under the floorboards, from the walls. Whispers, layered, overlapping, thousands of voices repeating the chant back to her. And in the mirror, she saw herself. Only her mouth was sewn shut, and her eyes were made of thread. At dawn, she found a note slipped under her door. No signature, no ink, just a square of robe fabric stitched with a single word, weaver. And below that, another line barely visible. The binding is not spoken, it is remembered. Sai fell to her knees. She understood. The chant was not a tool, it was a trigger. The binding didn't need voice, it needed grief, it needed memory, and now that it had hers, it would use it. That night, she stopped fighting. She laid out the robes. She placed her grandmother's coat in the center. She lit the incense, and she whispered, "I'm ready." The loom appeared behind her, not physically, but in the shadow, and she sat and began to weave. The first time it happened, Sai thought she was dreaming. She woke in the early hours of morning, just before dawn, to a heavy weight draped across her chest. The room was still, the air thick. For a moment she couldn't breathe, not from fear, but from pressure, as though something living pressed down on her. Then she looked down and saw it, one of the robes. The third one, the one with the torn corner and the faint outline of a handprint. It lay over her like a second skin, sleeves pulled tight, hem wrapped beneath her feet as if it had climbed onto her while she slept. Her heart stuttered. She hadn't opened the trunk. She hadn't touched the robes since the chanting. And yet, it fit, not loosely, but perfectly, as if it had been tailored for her body. She didn't scream. She moved slowly, unwrapping the fabric from her limbs, but the more she touched it, the more resistance it gave. The cloth clung to her wrists, to her back, to her throat. When she finally slipped it off, she dropped it onto the floor, breath ragged. But it didn't stay there. It folded itself, neatly, deliberately, and then it turned toward her, just slightly, like a flower leaning toward sunlight, or like a face finding your gaze. That day the villagers stopped speaking to her. The market woman, who once smiled at her every morning, now lowered her eyes and pretended not to see her. Children were pulled away from her path. Someone had tied salt bundles outside her door, twisted into the shape of a loom, and someone else had smeared her front step with chicken blood. Sai knew the signs. This wasn't fear. This was rejection. They knew she'd brought something back, something that chose her. That evening, she burned every strand of thread she could find in the house, curtains, mats, decorations, anything that could be used to carry a ritual, anything that felt like it could weave itself into her life. But when she opened the trunk to confront the robes, only 4 were there. The third one was gone. She turned around. It was already laid out on her bed. Sai no longer dreamed like she used to. Now her sleep was filled with processions, funerals that looped endlessly through fields of ash, figures in robes with no faces, each holding a needle, each pointing at her, each chanting without sound. And in the center of them all was the loom, alive, pulsing, calling her to take her place. She tried to run. She packed what little she had into a single bag, journal, incense, water, and made her way to the edge of the village. But the road was gone. Not blocked, not overgrown. Gone. The path she had walked dozens of times now led only to forest. Every turn, every curve led her back to the banyan tree with the red thread wrapped around its trunk. She was sealed in, not by walls, but by remembrance. When she returned to her homestay, the robe was waiting at the doorway, hanging on a nail, as if it always belonged there. She walked past it without touching it, but that night it returned to her body. In the mirror, Sai watched her reflection slowly change, each morning a little more red around the eyes, each night a new thread curling across her collarbone. By the third night, she saw a stitch beneath her left eyelid, and worse, she felt no fear, only acceptance. On the fifth day, she went into the village, not to shop, not to plead, but to observe. She stood in the center of the old square and watched as a funeral passed by. A boy no older than 10, draped in red cloth. Not saffron, not white, red, just like the robes. Sai stepped forward, but an elder stepped in her path, his eyes full of something deeper than hatred, something ancient. He said, "You've awakened it. The robe remembers. The loom is choosing." Sai's voice was a whisper. Choosing what? He didn't answer, only placed a single red thread in her palm and walked away. Back in her room, she stared at the thread. It was warm, wet, and when she closed her eyes, she heard her grandmother's voice, faint, weeping, calling her name like a lullaby. That night, Sai didn't resist the robe. She let it dress her. She let it pull its threads through her fingers, and when she looked in the mirror, her reflection smiled before she did. She began to forget the days of the week, the names of things, the reason she'd come. Only the chant remained, and the thread, and the robe. On the 7th day, someone knocked at her door. A child, no older than 5. He handed her a folded piece of parchment. Inside was a name, hers. Below it, a stitched phrase, "You are remembered." The robes weren't cursed. They were loyal, bound not by evil, but by grief so deep it refused to let go. And now they had Sai, not because she was weak, not because she was chosen, but because she remembered too much. She stood before the mirror one last time. The robe fit her body like memory. The stitches now ran up her spine. The loom waited. The chanting echoed in the walls. And as she stepped into the circle of robes, she whispered, "Then let me finish what he couldn't." It began with a dream. Sai was standing in the center of a bamboo hut deep in the jungle. The walls were crumbling, the thatched roof sagging under the weight of time. But in the middle of the room, untouched by dust or decay, sat a loom, tall, wide, ancient. She could hear it, breathing. Each thread stretched across its frame like a tendon, each spindle shivering with invisible movement. Something was being woven, slowly, steadily, strand by strand. She approached it, hands trembling. There, in the half-finished fabric, was a face, her own. When Sai awoke, her feet were dirty, mud-caked, her legs scratched by bramble. Pine needles clung to her robe, and her fingers were bleeding. Not from cuts, but from pressure. Strained, swollen, raw at the joints, as if they'd been working all night, weaving. She didn't remember leaving the house, but her instincts told her where to go. She packed nothing, brought nothing. She simply walked into the jungle and let the silence guide her. The hut was real. It stood hidden among trees twisted with red thread, its walls nearly consumed by vines. No roof tiles, no bell, just a skeletal shelter with one purpose: the loom. Sai stepped inside. The air was thick with dust, but not still. Something moved here, something remembered. The wooden frame of the loom gleamed with oil and age. It was impossibly clean, the floor beneath it swept bare. And upon the loom, a fabric was already forming. Red, patterned, the beginnings of a robe. She approached and touched the thread. Still warm, still wet. Blood clung to it. Her blood. Sai didn't leave the hut that night. She couldn't. Her legs refused to walk. Her breath came shallow, and her hands moved on their own, grasping the shuttle, drawing the weft, pulling the thread tight, over, under, pull, tie, repeat. The loom creaked softly with each movement, a lullaby made of grief. And behind her, though she never turned to see, someone watched, always just behind her shoulder, always whispering her name. She awoke on the floor the next morning. The robe on the loom had grown longer, and this time there was a symbol stitched into its center, a lotus flower. Inside it, a single eye, and in that eye, her grandmother's name, Traman, woven in golden thread. Sai staggered from the hut. Her head throbbed, her limbs ached, but the thread inside her felt stronger, hungrier. She passed 3 villagers on the path. Each one stared, none spoke. But later that night, she found something new outside her door. A needle, wrapped in black cloth, freshly oiled, waiting. She slept little, and when she did, she dreamt not of places or people, but of hands. So many hands, weaving, weaving, weaving. Each pair connected with red thread that stretched into the sky like veins into heaven. At the center of it all, the loom. But now it was alive. Its frame was bone, its thread made of hair, and its shuttle her own tongue. By the 3rd night, Sai returned to the hut without resistance. She sat before the loom and let it move her. The robe continued to grow, longer, more intricate. Symbols appeared, sigils she didn't understand but somehow recognized. A crow with no beak, a mouth sewn shut, a child's footprint, a broken bowl. Memories, maybe, or offerings, or warnings. One night, the robe spoke, not in words, but in breath. When Sai leaned close, she heard it inhale, a slow, raspy sound that pulled at the air around her. Then a whisper, "Finish me. Bind what was forgotten. Stitch the soul." The next morning, Sai found herself back in bed, the robe still at the loom, but her own clothes were stained red. Thread marks ringed her wrists like shackles. Her fingers were blistered, and in her journal, words she didn't write. "We do not weave for the dead. We weave for the ones who remember, and remembrance is a door." Sai began to forget what day it was. Time dissolved. She lived between two worlds now, the waking jungle and the loom. Every visit deepened the bond. Every thread tightened her memory to the fabric, until she began to see herself inside the robe. Not her face, her life. Moments stitched in secret. Her grandmother combing her hair as a child. The cold silence at her mother's funeral. The time she had stood in front of the temple in Bangkok, whispering, "I just want one more chance." The loom had heard her wish, and now it was granting it, thread by thread, price by price. Then one morning she awoke to find the robe gone. Not on the loom, not in the hut, not in her room. Gone. But she still felt it on her, inside her, in the way her breath slowed when she sat still, in the way her fingers moved when she wasn't thinking. The loom had finished itself, and now it wore her. It began with whispers in the field. Sai had gone outside that morning, barefoot without realizing, to the edge of the village where the rice paddies stretched toward the fog-draped hills. The sky was still gray. The birds were silent. Her hands trembled, though she didn't know why. And that's when she saw her. A woman, standing knee-deep in the mist, wrapped in a crimson robe so long it trailed across the water, bleeding color into the earth. Her face was turned away. Her arms hung at her sides. She wasn't moving. She wasn't alive. Sai froze. The figure didn't stir, didn't speak, but Sai knew who she was. She had never seen a photograph of Kamchai's mother. There were no records, no paintings. But memory didn't always need an image. Sometimes grief had a face of its own. And this face, pale, hollow-eyed, shadowed beneath layers of stitched fabric, was exactly as Sai had seen in her dreams. The woman in the threads, the one who'd whispered through the robes, the one the ritual had failed to silence. Sai stepped forward. The water was cold. It bit into her feet. But she moved slowly, reverently, the air thickening with each breath. The woman remained still. But as Sai reached the edge of the field, the figure turned. Only slightly. Enough for Sai to see what she wasn't meant to. Her mouth. It was sewn shut, but not like the others. This stitching was from the inside out, thread bursting through the skin, pulled taut with rage. Her eyes were darker than the sky, empty of color, empty of time. And yet, Sai felt herself begin to weep, not from fear, but from a grief that wasn't her own, a sorrow passed down through generations. The woman lifted one hand, thin, elongated, unnatural. In her palm was a folded piece of red cloth. Sai took it. Her fingers trembled as she opened it. Inside was a name, not hers, not Kamchai's, but another, a child's. And next to it, in faded thread, a message, still unremembered. Sai looked up, but the woman was gone. The field was empty. The mist evaporated, and the cloth in her hand had turned cold. That night, Sai placed the cloth on her altar. She surrounded it with salt, but it wasn't protection she sought. It was clarity. She needed to know what happened to Kamchai's mother. Why had she stayed? Why had she screamed? And why was her sorrow still spilling into Sai's life? The answer came at 3:33 a.m. Sai woke to the sound of breathing, not hers, not human. It came from beneath her floorboards, a slow inhale, a ragged exhale, then a voice, soft, cracking, almost like thread being torn apart. "I am the loom." Sai sat upright in the darkness. The walls of her room were moving, not shaking, shifting, as if the house itself were being woven anew. Thread snaked across the corners, spinning into patterns on the ceiling, curling into eyes along the floorboards. Everywhere she looked, the symbol appeared, the eye inside the lotus, the mark of remembrance. And then she saw her in the mirror. The woman in the threads, but this time closer. Standing directly behind her, her stitched mouth opened, bleeding threads, and she whispered, "I stitched the children into the robes, but he stitched me into the temple. I was the first to be remembered." Sai fled to the old monastery. She pounded on the doors until the novice boy appeared. His eyes were hollow, but he handed her a key, old, bronze, wrapped in red thread. No words passed between them, but she knew what it was. The key to the crypt beneath Wat Chao Sorn, the place where the mother loom was buried. She returned to the jungle at dawn. The fog clung to the trees like old breath. The vines parted as she walked, not with resistance, but with invitation. The temple doors opened without her touch. The robes swayed as she passed, and the altar, the loom, was empty. But behind it, beneath a trapdoor half rotted with age, the key fit, and the crypt opened. The stairs led down into earth, stone walls weeping moisture, the scent of mold and candle wax. At the bottom, a single room. At its center, a body, wrapped in a robe stitched to the walls, thread pulled taut in every direction, anchoring her limbs, her spine, her throat, her mouth. Kamchai's mother, still breathing, still weaving with her very presence. Sai fell to her knees. The body's eyes opened, black, wide, and her voice flooded the room like wind through cloth. "You wear what I died in. You speak what I forgot. Now finish the final stitch." Sai rose. Tears streamed down her cheeks. The robe on her back tightened. The thread around her fingers bled, and without meaning to, without wanting to, she whispered, "I will remember you. I will free you. I will take your place." And in the darkness, the loom began to spin once more. Not from wood, not from hand, but from memory. It had always been about the dead. That was the lie, the comfort, the rule that kept the ritual tolerable. Only the dead can be remembered. Only the dead can be woven. But Sai now understood the truth. The robe didn't care. The thread did not distinguish between grief for the dead and grief for the living. She no longer returned home. She stayed at the temple, sleeping in the crypt beside Kamchai's mother, whose body no longer decayed, no longer moved, but whose breath still curled in the cold air like silk. Above, the temple loomed hollow. Beneath, the threads grew longer. They reached through the floors, out through the earth, across the village. And one by one, the people began to feel it. It started with Noi, the woman who once shouted at Sai about her dog. She came to the temple on the third day, barefoot, her eyes red, mouth trembling. "My mother," she whispered. "She's not dead, but I see her in the walls." Sai didn't respond. Noi held out a piece of cloth. It was stitched with the name of a woman still alive. Not a spirit, not a ghost, a memory, a grudge. On the fifth night, a monk was found in the river, face down, wrapped in thread, still breathing but with no memory of who he was, just a phrase on repeat. "She saw me, she stitched me. She saw me, she stitched me." Sai watched from the temple steps as they pulled him out. She said nothing, but inside her, something wept. Not guilt, something older, recognition. The thread no longer needed her hands. It moved on its own now, from shadow to shadow, from grief to grief. Wherever a wound had been left open too long, it slid in like a needle into flesh, and it began to sew. Sai returned to the weaving hut one final time. The loom was gone. In its place was a single robe, finished, immaculate, crimson like heart blood, threaded with gold, with ash, with bone. It shimmered with breath. She touched it, and it spoke without sound. "Not yours, his." That night Sai dreamed of Kamchai for the first time. Not his shadow, not his journal, him. He sat beneath a Bodhi tree, skin pale, hands bloodied from years of weaving. He looked up at her and smiled, but his eyes were empty, his mouth stitched shut, and in his lap was a child's robe, still damp, still waiting. Sai awoke to a knock on the temple door. It was the village chief. He knelt before her. He didn't speak. He simply opened his hand and showed her a single braid of hair tied with red thread, a braid too fresh to belong to the dead. His daughter's. That was when Sai realized what the ritual had become. It no longer waited for death. It hunted memory itself. Love twisted into obsession. Grief twisted into hunger. The loom now spun wherever pain had been left unresolved, and it was weaving the living. She ran through the village that morning, robe trailing behind her like a flag of war. House after house bore marks of stitching, doors bound shut with thread, windows webbed with symbols, children crying in corners, whispering names of people still alive as if they were ghosts. Sai passed a mirror in the market square. Her reflection didn't look back. Instead, it faced sideways, watching the villagers, choosing. She screamed and shattered the mirror with her fist. Blood ran down her wrist in long, red strands. It looked like thread. It moved like thread. And in the air, a whisper. Grief remembers before death. She returned to the temple, her vision blurred. She found the crypt unraveling. The robes were climbing the walls, wrapping the stone, cocooning Kamchai's mother, now fully encased in a shroud of red and black. But the shape of her body shifted beneath the fabric, larger, stronger, changing. Sai dropped to her knees. This was never about saving you. It was about finishing you. And the voice replied, not from the body, but from the loom inside her mind. You cannot bind what never ended. You can only take its place. The robe in her arms began to move. It curled around her fingers, lifted itself to her shoulders, slid across her skin like breath. And as it sealed around her neck, she understood. She was no longer the weaver. She was the thread. From the distance, a sound like thunder rolled. Not from the sky, from beneath. The earth trembled, the villagers screamed, and red began to bloom across the land like veins surfacing on dying skin. Sai's final thought before her eyes turned to thread. I was never meant to finish the ritual. I was the final stitch.
The air cracked like bone. Somewhere deep in the belly of the jungle, the vines holding the walls of Wat Chao Sorn split apart, not from age, not from storm, but from something within. Something that had been bound too tightly for too long. And now it remembered. At sunrise, the villagers awoke to find the red thread had grown overnight. It stretched between trees, wrapped around homes, coiled in rice fields like sleeping serpents. One woman screamed when she saw her husband wrapped in it from ankle to neck, still breathing, but whispering his mother's name on repeat. Others found photographs, family heirlooms, even funeral garlands wrapped in new stitches, names altered, faces blurred, history rewritten in thread. Something ancient was no longer content with haunting memory. It was reweaving reality. Sai didn't sleep. Not anymore. Sleep was for those who could afford to forget. She stood before the altar in the ruined main hall of the temple, watching the loom pulse in the center like a heart. Its threads moved without hands now, floating, weaving themselves into something too large to see in one glance. Behind it, the crypt doors stood open, but no one dared go down, not even her. Because now the thing inside it wasn't just Kamchai's mother. It was all of them. Every robe that had ever held a soul, every thread that had ever remembered grief, every unfinished ritual. They had stitched themselves into her, and she had become the body of the ritual. Not a ghost, not a corpse, a loom of flesh. The bells began ringing at noon, all of them. Every old iron bell in the abandoned tower, long rusted silent, now screamed into the sky, clanging on their own, summoning no god but the forgotten. The sound echoed across the hills, and the villagers began to walk, one by one, in silence, mouths shut, eyes glazed, their clothes slowly unraveling as they moved, red thread spilling from their sleeves, wrapping around their arms, leading them back to the temple like marionettes pulled by history. Sai watched from the steps as they gathered, forming a circle around the temple grounds. Children, elders, even the monks. No one resisted, no one spoke, because the thread was not forcing them. It was familiar. It reminded them of everything they couldn't forget. Sai stepped inside. The temple walls breathed, literally. The wood expanded and contracted, sighing like lungs, exhaling dust, inhaling memory. The altar groaned, the loom began to turn, and down below, in the crypt, she rose. Sai descended the steps. The red light pulsed with each footfall, as though the temple recognized her tread. The robes on the walls whispered her name, some lovingly, some accusingly, but all with longing. She reached the bottom and saw her, the woman in the threads. But not as before. Now she stood fully upright. Her skin was a map of old grief, stitched with names, dates, rituals. Her eyes were sewn open now, and in them Sai saw all the memories ever bound in cloth. The children, the mothers, the suicides, the lost soldiers, the betrayed lovers. She saw Kamchai kneeling before her with blood on his hands, weeping into the loom. And then she saw herself. "I am not yours," Sai whispered. The woman's mouth cracked open, stitched tight but trembling. "You were never mine. You were the final weaver, the one who remembers everything." The threads moved. They coiled around Sai's wrists, her ankles, her throat. But this time, they didn't pull her down. They lifted her up. The loom turned faster. The bells roared. And in a single breath, Sai realized what had to happen. The ritual would never end unless someone chose to forget, unless someone gave the thread nothing left to remember. "I won't weave," she said. "I won't finish what he started. I release you." The woman screamed, not in hatred, but in grief. The robes on the wall tore, the crypt shuddered, the temple cracked, and from the earth below, thread ripped upward, writhing like serpents, trying to bind Sai to memory. But she held still and whispered the only word that could undo it. "Let go." The thread snapped, like 1,000 voices cut mid-sentence. The loom stilled. The temple groaned one final time, and silence returned. Not the silence of fear, the silence of release. Sai collapsed. The robes fell around her like dead petals. Kamchai's mother was gone. No body, no thread, just air, unbound. Above, the villagers stirred. The red thread vanished from their clothes, from their mouths, from their hearts. Some cried, some collapsed, some looked confused, missing something they could no longer name. But all of them turned and began to walk away. By morning, Wat Chao Sorn stood empty. No robes, no loom, just ruins, just memory. And at the center of the altar, Sai's journal, open to a final, unwritten page, its surface shimmering faintly with a single, invisible thread. Waiting.
The temple was quiet now. Too quiet. Not the silence of peace, but the silence that follows a storm, the kind that holds its breath, waiting to see what's been left behind. Sai stood in the center of Wat Chao Sorn, surrounded by crumbling wood, soot-stained beams, and the faint smell of old blood that still clung to the altar stones. The loom was gone. Kamchai's mother, gone. But one thing remained, a single robe, folded neatly at the center of the altar. It hadn't been there the night before. It hadn't existed in the crypt. It had not been part of the dozens that once covered the temple walls. It was new, fresh, perfect. And as Sai stepped closer, she saw what had been stitched into its hem in gold thread. Her name. The realization arrived slowly, like rot in wood, like thread unraveling from within. This was the final stitch. Not the robe that cursed the dead, not the robe that remembered grief, the robe that sealed the weaver. The ritual could not end with destruction. It had to end with binding. One soul left behind to carry the memory, to trap it, to stop it from leaking again. Kamchai had tried to bind his mother. Now the thread wanted to bind Sai. She didn't touch the robe. She didn't dare. But as she stared at it, she felt the old weight return, the heaviness in her bones, in her breath, in her heart. The ritual was finished. The temple was cleansed. But the memory still lived. And if she walked away, it would live on, in someone else. She carried the robe outside. The villagers were gone now. The jungle was quiet. The morning fog hovered low, like a veil between worlds. She brought the robe to the rice field, where she had first seen the woman in the threads, and placed it on the water. It floated, still, too still. And the wind stopped. Then she heard it, a child's voice, faint, behind her. "Don't forget me." Sai turned. There was no one there, just rows of stalks and the endless mist. But the robe had vanished, sunken into the water, or taken. She ran back to the temple, breathless, and there it was, again, folded on the altar, waiting. Sai fell to her knees. Her hands trembled. She thought of everything, her grandmother, her childhood, the first time she saw Kamchai's journal, the warmth of the red thread the night it first wrapped around her wrist. This wasn't a curse. It was a container, and someone had to hold it so that it didn't spread again. But it didn't have to be her. Not entirely. Not if she could unravel it from the inside. She spent the next 3 nights in silence, alone, sewing, not weaving, but undoing. She used her own blood, her own hair. She whispered the chant backwards, not to bind, but to release. She rewrote the sigils in reverse, carefully pulling apart each line of thread that had once held grief like a coffin holds bone. She didn't sleep. She didn't eat. The temple pulsed with pressure. The earth groaned, but she kept going. On the 4th night, the robe began to fall apart. The threads came loose like veins unraveling. The gold letters faded. Her name disappeared, and the fabric turned white, colorless, weightless, unbound. The temple shook. A sound like 100 weeping mouths filled the air. Sai collapsed, thread burned into her palms, breath shallow. And in that moment she saw Kamchai again, not kneeling, not broken, but smiling. Beside him stood his mother, and dozens of others, all wrapped in memory, but no longer bound. They turned to her and bowed, then vanished. The loom was gone, forever. But one thread remained, thin, red, lying across the floor. Sai picked it up, wrapped it around her finger, and whispered, "You remember now, so I don't have to." The first thing they found was the recorder, a small, battered device wrapped in red cloth, placed gently on the temple altar. It was still warm, still humming, still recording. They pressed play and heard her voice, calm, tired, threaded with something deeper than fear. Acceptance, If you're hearing this, it means I chose not to be remembered. I've spent weeks unthreading the ritual, pulling apart the grief stitched into this land. But memory, real memory, isn't so easily burned. The loom may be gone, the robes may be ash, but the stories, they always survive. In dreams, in fields, in thread left behind. Sai's voice pauses, then returns, slower now, quieter. I left the robe in the wind, not to forget, but to scatter, to make remembering gentle again, to keep it from becoming hunger. But you, whoever you are, you're listening, and that means the thread reached you. That means it's starting again. So listen carefully, and never, ever weave when you're grieving. The tape clicks softly. The last thing it captures is a long, deep breath. Then the sound of footsteps walking away. Not hurried, not afraid, just done. They never found her body. The villagers searched the temple, the rice fields, the jungle paths swallowed by root and vine, but Sai was gone. Some say she walked into the mountains. Some say she became the final thread woven into the mist, the memory, the silence that returned after the ritual ended. Others say she still visits the abandoned temple at night, watching from the shadows of the beams, wrapped in a robe that flickers between red and white, neither cursed nor free, just there. The robe? It was never found either. But the stories? They multiplied. In the months that followed, strange things began to appear across northern Thailand. Red thread curled around the stems of banana trees. Old looms in shuttered weaving huts spun in the night without hands. Children whispered the names of relatives long dead, and sometimes not yet dead. Elders told of a woman who came to them in their dreams, gently weaving a cloth from their regrets, asking, "Would you like to be remembered, or would you like to rest?" No one ever answered, and that, perhaps, was the point. In a village market, an old man found a folded piece of white cloth inside his satchel. No note, no explanation. Just one loose red thread and a name embroidered in a language he didn't know. When he looked it up, he learned it meant, "The weaver never dies, she only changes hands." Somewhere in the city, a scholar cataloging ancient funeral rituals received an anonymous package. Inside was a needle and a journal. The first line read, "We don't weave for the dead. We weave for the ones we can't let go." Even now, when the wind changes direction in the hills of Chiangdao, some say they hear a sound, not quite wind, not quite breath, not quite a whisper, but the unmistakable rhythm of a shuttle sliding across a loom, back and forth, endless, unstoppable. Sai's name was never recorded in the village history, but her thread was, tied around a child's wrist for protection, knotted into the base of a spirit house, hung from a tree in the shape of a lotus eye. A story too heavy for truth, too quiet for scripture, but still told, in murmurs, in lullabies, in dreams. And in the heart of the jungle, if you walk far enough, alone enough, quiet enough, you may still find Wat Chao Sorn. And if you do, don't bring scissors, don't hum the chant, don't wear red, and whatever you do, don't touch the loom, because it's waiting, and it never sleeps.